Hello everyone and welcome to a look back at Canadian Pacific Excursion Engines. A lot of you really seemed to like the last video, and a user by the name of Grand Truck Studios 2816 suggested that I do one on Canadian Pacific engines, so here it is. Unlike the last video, I'll be talking about these engines in no particular order. There are also a lot of engines on this list, so if I miss any, please let me know in the comment section below. Without further ado, let's get started. Our first engine is Canadian Pacific 1201. 1201 was built in 1944 in the Angus shops for Canadian Pacific and is designated as a G5A Pacific. During its career in revenue service, 1201 hauled commuters and local freights. 1201 operated on Canadian Pacific until it was retired in the late 1950s to early 1960s along with the rest of the steam fleet. The engine was slated to be scrapped in 1962, but instead was donated to the Canadian government in 1966. The engine was then given to the National Museum of Science and Technology and restored to operation. It then operated on many mainline excursions throughout the late portion of the 20th century. During its excursion career, the engine even appeared at Steam Expo in 1986, along with many other steam engines from around the world. Unfortunately, 1201's fire was dropped in 1990 and is now on display in the National Museum of Science and Technology. And now we move on to what will probably take up most of this video, the engines of Steamtown. First, let's talk about Canadian Pacific 1246. 1246 was built by the Montreal Locomotive Works in June 1946 and is another G5A Pacific, meaning it is a sister to 1201. After retirement, the engine was bought by F. Nelson Blunt for his Steamtown USA collection in Bellows Falls, Vermont. In the fall of 1983, when the collection was moving from Bellows Falls to Scranton, Pennsylvania, 1246 was the engine that hauled the Farewell to Vermont excursions. The engine also had a short stint of operation on the Green Mountain Railway from 1976 to 1973 before being sold back to Steamtown. After the collection had moved, 1246 continued to operate until 1986, when it was pulled from service as it was deemed unfit to operate on the new line. From 1996 to 2008, 1246 was placed on static display at the Valley Railroad in Essex, Connecticut. In 2008, 1246 was moved to the Naugatuck Railway in Thomaston, Connecticut, where she now remains today. Next, we have Canadian Pacific 1278. Now, 1278 was influential in changing how steam tourist railroads are operated, but not in the way that you think. 1278 was built by the Canadian Locomotive Company in April of 1948, and had the same duties as 1201 and 1246, as once again, it's another 1200 class Pacific. In 1965, F. Nelson Blunt purchased 1278, just like he did with engine 1246. During its excursion career at Steamtown, 1278 was renumbered to engine 127. In 1970, 1278 was leased to the Cadillac and Lake City Railway before being returned in 1971. After the Steamtown collection had moved to Scranton, Pennsylvania, they made a trade with the Gettysburg Railroad. In turn, they got Canadian National 3254, and the Gettysburg Railroad got 1278. Now here is where the story of 1278 gets really interesting. 1278 operated for several years on the Gettysburg Railroad, but here's the problem. They didn't service or run the engine correctly. In videos taken of 1278 while operating on the Gettysburg Railroad, you could hear its air compressor wheezing as if it's not running correctly, as well as other small things. All of this culminated on the evening of June 16, 1995, when several errors operating the engine and serving maintenance caused the crown sheet of the engine to collapse. 3 crewmen were injured in the escaping blast of steam that ensued immediately afterwards. This accident caused many rule changes which improved safety on many steam tourist lines that operate today. After the Gettysburg Railway closed and the equipment was auctioned off, the engine ended up at the Age of Steam Roundhouse under the ownership of Jerry Jacobson, where it now sits today. Next up is Canadian Pacific 1293. 1293 was built by the Canadian Locomotive Company in June of 1948 and is another 1200 class Pacific. In 1964, 1293 was bought by, you guessed it, F. Nelson Blunt for Steamtown, USA, and moved to Bellows Falls, Vermont. In 1979, 1293 was temporarily renumbered to 1881 and starred in the horror movie Terror Train. In the 1980s, when the Steamtown collection moved to Scranton, Pennsylvania, 1293 was not fired up at the new location. The engine sat in storage for many years until being bought in 1996 by Jerry Jacobson. It was then restored to run daily trips along the Ohio Central route. As of today, 1293 is part of the Age of Steam roundhouse and will see occasional use on excursions and steam photo freights. And finally, to end off the engines from Steamtown, we have Canadian Pacific 2317. 2317 was built by the Montreal Locomotive Works in 1923 and is a G3C class Pacific. After retirement from Canadian Pacific, 2317 started operating on Steamtown property in 1978. When the Steamtown collection moved to Scranton, Pennsylvania, 2317 was one of the first engines to pull trips on the new route. In 2010, 2317 had to go for its FRA-mandated 15-year rebuild and has not returned to service since. Although that is all for the engines that operated at Steamtown, we still have one more engine that operated south of the border. Next up is engine 2839. 2839 was built by the Montreal Locomotive Works in 1937 and operated for many years until it was retired in 1959. At first, 2839 was destined for a railroad museum in Canada, but instead it was given to a group of owners in Pennsylvania who restored it to operating condition. After being restored to operation, 2839 was leased to the Southern Railway for their steam excursion program, which was very popular in the 70s, 80s, and early 90s. Some of 2839's running mates at the time include Southern Railway 4501, Southern Railway 630, Southern Railway 722, Texas and Pacific 610, and Chesapeake and Ohio 2716. In 1980, 2839 was retired from the Southern Steam Excursion program as it could not pull the heavy trains. Today, 2839 is on display in the Nethercock Museum in Sylmar, California. And now, we've come to probably the most popular engine on this list, Canadian Pacific 2816. Built by the Montreal Locomotive Works in 1930, 2816 is an H-1B class Hudson that was originally signed to passenger duties all along the CP system. After it was retired in 1960, 2816 found itself at Steamtown, USA in Bellows Falls, Vermont, where it remained on display for many years. In 1998, 2816 was brought back to Canada for restoration, and according to Chief Mechanical Operator of a restoration, Al Broadfoot, it was the first engine to ever be brought back after leaving Canada. In 2001, 2816's restoration was complete, and she began her new lease on life with a 5-day run from Vancouver, British Columbia to Calgary, Alberta. After that, 2816 began operating on excursions all over Canada. 2816 even came back to the US in 2007 and double-headed with Milwaukee Road 261. In 2011, 2816 even starred in her own IMAX movie, The Empress. In 2012, however, 2816 was abruptly retired from excursion service. Anyway, 2816 is now in storage in British Columbia and needs an inspection if it ever wants to run again. Moving from one Hudson to another, let's talk about locomotive number 2860. 2860 was built in 1940 by the Montreal Locomotive Works and hauled transcontinental passenger trains along the CP system. After being retired in 1959, 2860 sat in a scrapyard for many years. In 1974, 2860 was bought by BC Rail and then restored to operation for excursion service between North Vancouver, British Columbia and Squamish. During its excursion career, it was also one of the engines to appear at Steam Expo in 1986, mentioned earlier. After Steam Expo, 2860 continued to operate until 1999 when it was retired from excursion service. The engine was then briefly used again in excursion service from 2007 to 2010 before being retired once more. As of today, 2860 is on display at the West Coast Railway Heritage Park in Squamish, British Columbia, awaiting restoration. We now change gears to the Canadian Pacific 3716. 3716 was built in 1912 by the Montreal Locomotive Works and is a 280 consolidation. After being retired, 3716 was restored back to operation in 1975. During its new lease on life, 3716 served as a backup engine to Canadian Pacific 2860 on runs between Vancouver and Squamish. Eventually, 3716 was given to the Kettle Valley Steam Railway in Summerlin, British Columbia. As of today, 3716 continues to operate on the Kettle Valley Steam Railway. Now we transition to an engine that's on the smaller side of the scale, number 1057. 1057 was built by the Montreal Locomotive Works in 1912 and is a 260 mogul. 1057 was assigned various tasks along the CP system until it was retired in 1959. In 1973, 1057 was restored to operation for use on mainline excursions. In excursion service, 1057 saw use on both Canadian Pacific and Canadian National rails. 1057 continued operating in mainline excursion service until it was retired in 1977. In the early to mid-2000s, 1057 found herself on the South Simcoe Railway in Ontario. While on the South Simcoe Railway, 1057 was used as a running mate to Engine 136. As of today, 1057 now sits dormant on South Simcoe Railway property. While on the topic of South Simcoe Railway engines, our next engine is locomotive number 136. 136 is a 440 built by the Rogers Locomotive Works in 1883. 136 operated on the CP system until it was retired in 1959. During the 1970s, 136 was used also on mainline excursions, even double-heading with 1057 on the Credit Valley Railway. Like 1057, 136 found its way to the South Simcoe Railway and continues to operate today. And that concludes a look back at Canadian Pacific Excursion Stars. I would like to acknowledge two engines that I did leave out, 1077 and 2811, as I could not find sufficient information about them. What I do know about 2811 is that it did operate in excursion service in the 60s when it was sadly scrapped. Other than that, I do not know anything else about the engine. What I know about 1077 is that it operated at Steam Expo in 1986 and now operates on the Fort Steele Railway in British Columbia. If there are any engines that I missed, let me know in the comments section below, and if there are enough, I may make a part 2. If you have any constructive criticisms, ideas for videos, or want to see another video like this, also let me know in the comments section below. That's all for this video, and thanks for watching a look back at Canadian Pacific Excursion Stars.